wanted though to maybe transition to maybe going from the social to causal, because I'm also interested in etiology and what are the exact factors that are at play in the development of autism, ASD, or whatever way we want to describe it. I'm thinking more or less biopsychosocial in this respect. What are some of the biological factors and the psychological factors and the social factors? Based on my own understandings, from what I gather, a lot of factors are biological in nature. Genetic influence, heritability, and also an interplay though with the environment. As well. So it goes both ways. And,
indeed, it does.
And I know there's also the social dimension too. I know that certain things like extreme social deprivation can often has been correlated with autistic behaviors and so on and so forth. So maybe I'll just pass it on to you and feel free to address any of that in any way you'd like. So.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's a complex mixture of these things. There's actually, I mentioned this earlier, research showing with twins, identical twins, even, that you can often see that there is more likely that you will see both twins are autistic, so very genetic, but interestingly, not in the same way. Like you can see one twin is much more obviously autistic than the other twin. I've actually seen this once or twice, and it is really disconcerting in a way to see these visibly identical people, and yet one of them in their behavior, clearly seems to be much more obviously outwardly autistic. Whatever's going on internally in their head, it's much more obvious externally. And that is just, a phenomenon that points to some of the complexity here. That, there's genetic factors. Some of that is related to specific genetic variants. They're usually also very heavily related to intellectual disability or other sorts of co-occurring conditions. But then you've also got this sort of polygenetic, I don't know what the right word for it is, a mess maybe, a polygenetic mess where you've just got a ton of different things all interacting with each other and with the environment. And sometimes that results in autism and sometimes that does not. And that's what we would tend to call idiopathic autism, where there's not necessarily like a clear single genetic cause. But even when there is a clear single genetic cause, it's not deterministic. So for example, Fragile X syndrome is one example of a specific genetic variant that's very heavily related to autism, as well as various other diagnoses, including intellectual disability and anxiety. And Fragile X syndrome often ends in autism, but not always. And that's very common, that even where there is like a specific single genetic cause, it doesn't lead to autism all the time. So then that leads to the question of what sorts of environmental factors are involved. And that's, I think, a very tricky field. It's a very tricky field because there's a temptation there to go and say, oh, well, we're going to do a study and we're going to go and see whether there is some factor in people's environments that's related to the likelihood that they develop autism after we control for everything else we can think of that might be related. But I can't remember if this paper might actually have been in the statistics class that we both took. Brian, does ice cream pool deaths mean anything to you?
Yes, it rings a bell, yes.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite papers because it explains so much. So the author of this paper, they were saying, well, let's imagine that we're trying to examine the relationship between ice cream consumption and the likelihood of drowning in the pool. And if we are using our good researcher hats, we realize that there's a confounding variable here, that when it's hot, people are probably going to drink ice cream and they're probably also going to go in the pool. So that could introduce a spurious relationship. So being good researchers, we measure the temperature and we control for it. But we measure temperature imperfectly. Instead of using the actual temperature, we just ask people, on a scale of like 1 to 5, how hot do you feel today? And that's not a perfect measure. So when we try and regress out the influence of that confounder, we fail to do so because it was imperfect. And so we still end up concluding that ice cream caused people to drown in the pool, which is just a failure of research methods. So I think that as far as specific environmental causes, we are still in our infancy there because frankly, sometimes it's hard to be sure that the researchers have thought of every single possible confounding variable or that they've measured them all correctly. So we know, I guess, that, there's very little that I think we can be really confident about. As far as specific environmental causes, I suspect that things in the prenatal environment are very heavily involved. There may be some autoimmune stuff in there. Ironically, for people who think that the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine causes autism, pretty much the first environmental cause of autism that was actually pretty definitively proven is that maternal rubella causes autism. So get your MMR vaccines. If you don't want to be autistic or have your kids be autistic, get your MMR vaccine. So that's a big irony there for those who are anti-vaxxers. But yeah, and then you also mentioned this other question of social influences, and that's a fraught area. That's a fraught area because there is this history in the autism world of blaming parents, and specifically mothers, because people were sexist, blaming mothers for autism. This was the idea of the refrigerator mother, that the mother was cold and unfeeling, and this caused autism. And there's a possibility there that maybe people were noticing autistic parents and blaming the autistic parents for their kids also being autistic, which is just genetic. It's also possible that this was a spurious effect because in the early days, autism tended to be diagnosed in people who were very high in socioeconomic status, who tended to be like achievement-oriented, I guess, because that's how they got to be of high socioeconomic status. So whatever was going on there, anyway, the idea was wrong. Autism is not caused by refrigerator mothers or refrigerator fathers, for that matter. Not that anybody was talking about refrigerator fathers. And that doesn't mean, though, that the social environment isn't relevant. And, one thing that people do talk a lot about today is how there might be some sorts of developmental cascades where things that are not inherently, the characteristics of autism develop as a result of an altered sort of developmental trajectory that affects what people's experiences end up being early in development. So it seems as though autistic people early in life, have sort of a different way of attending to things in the world very often. And very often autistic people end up sort of focused on particular things in their environment that are of interest to them. And that may mean, for example, that they are paying less attention to other people around them, paying less attention to other people who are trying to have social interactions with them, or direct their attention towards interesting things in the environment that they could learn from. And so it's thought that this lack of social attention, this lack of joint engagement with other people tends to result in some loss of opportunities to learn useful skills and development. And probably the autistic people who end up with the most skills and end up scoring highest on IQ tests probably are the autistic people who don't have so much of this as other autistic people. And so a lot of the questions and debates around early intervention sort of revolve around, is there an issue here, and what would be the best and most humane and least damaging way of trying to give people some of these early useful experiences without sort of trampling out their autism, unless you're one of those people who thinks that trampling out the autism is A, desirable, or B, possible. So there, that's my answer to that one. Sorry for going on so long, but it's a complex question that you asked.
Yeah, no, it was a complex question. It demanded a complex answer. And I think that's what we got.